The phone rang just after 4:30 in the morning. On the other end was Christopher Boon. He was calling from his mother's house. His voice was flat, almost casual, but in contrast to that, he shared a horrifying secret with the call handler. When police arrived at the home on Dexter Way in Gloucester just 10 minutes later, they were met with a silent, surreal horror. The kitchen floor held a sight that would leave attending officers requiring therapy. And though the rest of the house appeared quiet, Christopher's youngest daughters, just 6 and 2, were still upstairs. They were alone, awake, and very much aware of what had just happened feet away. By the way, this is Dark Case, and you can call me Jack. I bring you true crime documentaries and other things that you may later regret knowing. Please do join the amazingly supportive Dark Case family by hitting subscribe now, and make sure that you have all notifications turned on. And now my silly little question. Tell me, what's the weirdest dream that you've ever had? Just drop it down in the comments and I'll read all of them. All Patreon or channel membership support goes a really long way, and I can't thank you all enough, but still, thank you so much. But now, on with the video. When Christopher Boon showed up in Laura Mortimer's life, his history wasn't just checkered, it was already marked with extreme violence. 8 years prior, in early 2010, he was convicted of attacking a previous partner, along with the partner's mother. That attack happened in front of 2 young children. He was given a suspended prison sentence for assault, for battery, and criminal damage. So he served no actual jail time, this was just a warning on paper, possibly the first of many arguable decisions by the system. Christopher met Laura Mortimer in 2010, a woman that had a daughter from a previous relationship named Ella Dalby. There's no indication that Laura had any idea about Christopher's previous conviction when she met him later on in that same year. And crucially, no one told her. This case was before the wider rollout of Clare's Law in the UK, a legal tool that allows someone to request disclosure of a partner's criminal history. It meant that Laura had no formal way of accessing his record unless she or a loved one specifically asked police for access to that information. At that point, at the start, Christopher was far from a monster to Laura. He was charming, helpful, and exactly what Laura, an ambitious young mother and wedding planner, wanted to believe in. But by this stage, he'd already had a lot of practice at hiding the truth, and the criminal justice system didn't seem to be holding him to account. Within just weeks of meeting Laura, Christopher had moved into her home, and within just a few months, she was pregnant. To the outside world, things looked like they were moving fast, but like the couple were happy. Laura was building her own bridal business, a business which she cutely named Sweet Beginnings. She was lively, determined, and known for making other people's dreams come true. Behind closed doors though, the cracks were already forming in the relationship. But regardless of this, the two would still get married. It turns out that Christopher was controlling with money. Every bit of Laura's income went into his bank account. Over time, the woman began withdrawing. Her family noticed the weight loss. They saw that she was exhausted, and they felt the quiet tension that hovered over her every move. But whenever they asked her what was going on, she would just brush it off. She could handle him, she said. And even if she couldn't, it's not like he'd been physical with her, at least not yet. It was Boxing Day, the 24th of December 2014, when Laura ran out of her home wearing only her underwear. She was hysterical, she was injured, and she was absolutely terrified. She banged on her neighbour's door and told them that Christopher Boon had attacked her. When police arrived, they were there within just 6 minutes. Photos were taken of Laura's injuries, and officers spoke to neighbours, the people who had witnessed her distress firsthand. And crucially, they heard something from daughter Ella, who was just 8 years old at the time. Ella had seen and heard what happened to her mum. She made comments at the scene that corroborated Laura's version of events. But despite that, no formal effort was made to secure her statement. The officers did arrest Christopher that night, and he was taken into custody and then interviewed by a domestic abuse specialist. At that time, he denied hurting Laura, and not long after, Laura began walking her story back. She now told officers that she didn't want to press charges. She didn't want to go through a trial, and she didn't want to escalate the situation. She said that she'd be okay, and so she went back home with him. What police didn't do was follow up with daughter Ella. They had a credible witness that was in the house, and they let her voice go officially unheard. This moment, according to the Serious Case Review published years later, was the one and only known physical incident by Christopher against Laura or Ella before what happened. And it was a moment that, against all odds, was still somehow missed. So, despite the mounting evidence, no charges were ever filed against Christopher. Gloucestershire Police later said that while their officers acted swiftly, the decision not to prosecute was in line with policy at the time, and without Laura's cooperation, it was deemed that there wasn't enough to proceed. However, the review would later find otherwise. There was plenty there to build a victimless prosecution. There was Laura's initial statement. There was her visible injuries. There were the statements of their neighbours who helped her. Of course, there were Ella's words. And there was proof of Christopher Boon's past. What it seems was missing, though, was the will to link it all together. Frustratingly, no effort was made to involve outside agencies. No specialist consultation to pursue charges without Laura's support. There was no safeguarding team that followed up on Ella's experiences, so Christopher was set free with no charges, and Laura's bruises would heal. However, the pattern had already been set, and he learned something important that night, that there were no real consequences, not for him at least. By 2015, Christopher's dark behaviour had moved underground. There were no more obvious injuries. There were no late-night police calls. But his control on Laura was tightening. He completely controlled her money. Her business that she'd been working so hard on, that money just went straight to him, and Laura never seemed to have any money of her own. Christopher managed her time too. Family later learned that she only had one front door key, and Christopher had the back door key. He kept control of the keys to the house, which is made even worse when I remind you that this was actually Laura's home. She had to be home when he returned, or he couldn't get in. He isolated her, slowly and deliberately. Her visits with family became less frequent. Calls went unanswered, and when she did show up, the brightness had faded from her eyes. Friends and loved ones did try to check in, but Laura downplayed everything. Only one time, when Christopher was seen with another woman, did Laura react with visible anger. Christopher responded to this, though, by threatening the friend who'd seen him and told Laura. He warned them and their family to watch their backs. At home, Laura was now walking on eggshells, and Ella, although young, she was watching everything and knew exactly what was happening. She loved her mother, and she wanted to protect her from this invader in their home. Between 2010 and 2018, Ella's behaviour at school was flagged multiple times. She was struggling to focus. She was now acting out, and she was defiant with teachers. Eventually, she was diagnosed with ADHD, but no one asked why a happy, expressive child had now started withdrawing. Very possibly a misdiagnosis. No one asked her what her home life was really like. Perhaps after the first incident, she realised that no one in authority would even listen. And to make things even worse, every time there was a meeting at school, Christopher Boon made sure he was there. Ella's biological father, Tom Dalby, was left out. He was never called in. He was no longer included in the decision-making. And in one case, Christopher even claimed that Ella was a liar. He'd say anything to protect himself. During this time too, Laura and Christopher would bring 2 more daughters into their world. Exactly what home was like for the girls, I honestly dread to think. It's just awful to even begin to consider. Laura now started visiting her GP often. She came in for stomach pains, backaches, and fatigue. She sometimes also had notable weight loss. On another visit, she had injuries to her legs. But each time she visited the doctors, the physical symptoms were treated. But the context, the pattern of these issues, both were seemingly ignored. No professional connected the dots, and none of them ever asked Laura the question that may have saved her life. Is someone hurting you at home? By May 2018, Laura had made her decision. She was done. She told her friends that Christopher had gone for her again, and this time she wasn't backing down. She wanted a divorce, and she gave him a deadline. He now had 2 weeks to move out of her house. 10 days before the final event, Christopher Boon punched a wall in a fit of rage. His hand was injured badly enough that it had to be set in a cast. But the most chilling of all wasn't the act of striking the wall, it was what he said when he did it that was meant for your face. Laura was now actively trying to move forwards. On May the 27th, she went out to the pub with friends. She laughed, she danced, she told them she was ready for a fresh start. Her business was thriving, her girls were now all growing up, and to make things perfect, she just needed him gone. When she got home that night, she FaceTimed her aunt at 1:18 a.m, and that would be the last time that anyone outside of that house would see her alive. There is a framework developed by criminologist Professor Jane Monckton Smith. She studied hundreds of domestic homicide cases and found that they often follow a chilling, predictable pattern. These are 8 stages that build over time. Stage 1 is the pre-relationship history of control or abuse. Christopher Boon had that. There was the prior conviction in 2010 for what he did to his previous partner and her mother. Stage 2 is moving in quickly. He moved into Laura's home within just a few weeks. Stage 3 is escalation of control. This is through isolation, financial restriction, or intimidation. Remember, he took her income. He managed her door keys. He tried to cut her off from friends and family. Then stage 4, a trigger event. Laura discovered that he'd been out with another woman. He wasn't happy. Stage 5, a change in thinking. Christopher began to feel that he was losing control and that the tables were now turned against him. Stage 6 is planning. He punched the wall and threatened her, refusing to leave. And then there's stages 7 and 8. Stage 7 is the act itself. Sometime in the early hours of May the 28th, Christopher attacked. Laura bravely fought back against her husband. She had defensive marks across her arms and hands. She was jabbed at 18 times, 13 of those to her face and neck. Brave daughter Ella, hearing the chaos from upstairs, got out of bed. She was 11 years old. She ran towards the danger. She tried desperately to help her mother. And so, Christopher Boon turned on her, too. She was jabbed at with a sharp implement a disgusting 24 times. Some strikes were so forceful that they splintered bones. Her mother's red DNA on her feet showed that she had entered the room whilst Laura was already in severe trouble. But even that didn't stop her from trying to help. Ella and her mum were found lying side by side on the kitchen floor. The 2 youngest girls were still inside the house, alone with the bodies. They were, however, thankfully, alive and not physically harmed. But for them, nothing would ever be the same again. Stage 8 is the aftermath of the attack. Christopher fled the house and called his mother. He told her what he'd done, and together they called the police. And then he simply waited. Police arrived just 10 minutes later. Christopher Boon was obviously arrested, and here is an excerpt from his police interview. As you can see, his cast is still on his arm from his previous threats towards Laura.
Grounds and reasons for your arrest. You were arrested yesterday, the 28th of May, 2018, at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sandhurst Lane in Gloucester. You were arrested on suspicion of the murder of your wife, Laura Boon, and your 11-year-old stepdaughter, Ella Dalby, both of who were discovered deceased at your home address of 4 Dexter Way in Gloucester in the early hours of the morning.
In the aftermath, Laura and Ella's family didn't just disappear into silence. Instead, they bravely stepped into the chaos. They started demanding change. Laura's mother, Hilary Stinchcombe, and Ella's paternal grandmother, Kim Clements, became relentless advocates for justice. Together with Laura's sister, Jo Piontek, they took on the institutions that they believed had failed them. When the Domestic Homicide Review first came out, the family was horrified. Early drafts described Laura as, and I quote, a rubbish mum, and implied that she drank too much. This was not only inaccurate, it was heartless and insulting. Laura wasn't weak. She wasn't a bad mother. She was surviving, she was running a business, she was protecting her children, and she was trying to escape. The family fought for the report to actually reflect the truth, and amazingly, they won. With the help of advocate Sue Hale from Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, they reshaped the review into something actually meaningful. It now stands as a case study in systemic failure, and also as a call to action. But their work didn't stop there. They've pushed for mandatory training on coercive control. They've called for better listening to children's voices. And they fought for a centralized system to track repeat offenders, so patterns like Christopher Boon's can't be buried by disconnected files. As Sister Jo put it, if we save the next child or the mother's life, it is worth everything. In November 2018, Christopher Boon stood in Bristol Crown Court. He had initially pleaded not guilty, but that changed, quietly and coldly, just before the trial. He now admitted to both murders. The judge didn't hold back. She described the attack as wanton savagery. Laura had fought for her life, she said, and Ella had bravely come to the aid of her mother and must have witnessed the attack before Boon turned the knife on her. The court heard about Christopher's past convictions, about the 2014 assault, about the countless signs that were missed. Laura's mother Hilary spoke through tears. She called her daughter a wonderful, devoted mother. She called Ella her beautiful, adored first grandchild. Ella's father Tom said, "Every day I feel the terror and pain that Ella must have felt in those last moments of her life." More than 1,000 mourners filled Gloucester Cathedral for their funeral. Christopher Boon was sentenced to life in prison, and he will serve a minimum of 29 years. But even with this in mind, there is no punishment in the world that could bring Laura or Ella back. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.